Picture a night somewhere in Africa, about 1 million years ago, give or take. A small group of hominids, not quite us, not quite not us, are doing what every other animal on the savannah is doing at night, which is trying very hard not to get eaten. They're in a tree. Several trees, actually, because sleeping on the ground is an excellent way to end your genetic lineage in a single evening. They're cold. The African night drops fast and far, and their bodies are generating heat but losing it faster than feels comfortable. Around them, the darkness is not empty. It moves, it breathes. It occasionally makes sounds that would cause a modern human to immediately reconsider their life choices. And then, about 300 meters away, a lightning strike hits a dry acacia. The tree catches. The fire spreads through the dry grass around it in a roaring orange wall that sends every animal in the vicinity fleeing in panic. Every animal except the hominids in the trees, who watch it with something that is not quite awe, and not quite fear, and not quite curiosity, but some evolutionary precursor to all three simultaneously. Over the following days, these hominids will cautiously approach the burned zone. They will find roasted tubers, roasted insects, small animals that didn't escape in time, their flesh transformed by heat into something dramatically more digestible than the raw version. The hominids will eat these things. Their brains will process the caloric windfall in a way that maps, neurologically, very close to what we would call pleasure. This is the story of how fire entered the human story. It did not begin with deliberate ignition, it began with opportunistic exploitation of naturally occurring fire. And it was so transformative that the question of what humanity would look like without it is genuinely one of the most consequential thought experiments available to the curious mind. So, what if it never happened? What if that lightning strike missed? What if, across the entire span of human prehistory, no hominid ever sat down next to a natural fire and thought, "This is useful, this is mine, this is something worth keeping"? The answer rewrites everything, and we are going to walk through it, all of it, from the biology outward to the civilization that never existed. Start at the most fundamental level, the human body itself. The body you are currently living in is, in a very deep and underappreciated sense, a product of fire. Not metaphorically, biologically, directly. The relationship between cooking and human anatomy is so intimate and so ancient that removing fire from the equation doesn't just change what humans ate. It changes what humans physically are. Here is the core of it. Raw food is extraordinarily difficult to process. The nutrients in raw plant matter are largely locked behind cell walls that human digestive systems can break down only partially and inefficiently. Raw meat contains the same calories as cooked meat, but requires dramatically more digestive energy to extract, and carries bacterial loads that a gut evolved for cooked food handles poorly. The caloric yield from a raw food diet, for an animal with the brain size and body composition of a modern human, is simply insufficient to sustain that brain and that body simultaneously. The human brain is metabolically extravagant. It accounts for roughly 2% of your body weight and consumes approximately 20% of your resting caloric budget. Running this organ is expensive in a way that creates a fundamental tension with the rest of the body's energy demands. Something has to give. In the evolutionary history that actually happened, the one with fire, the solution to this tension was cooking. Heat breaks down cell walls, denatures proteins, gelatinizes starches, and pre-processes food in ways that dramatically increase the caloric yield per gram consumed and reduce the digestive energy required to extract those calories. Cooking is, in effect, external predigestion. It outsources part of the gut's work to the fire, which allowed evolution to redirect resources away from maintaining an enormous digestive system and toward expanding the brain. Examine the digestive anatomy of modern humans compared to other great apes, and the evidence is striking. Human guts are dramatically smaller relative to body size than those of chimpanzees or gorillas. Our intestines are shorter. Our stomachs are smaller. Our jaws are weaker. Our teeth are smaller. Our chewing musculature is less developed. All of these are features of an animal that has been eating pre-processed food, cooked food, for long enough that natural selection has optimized the digestive system for that input and redirected the freed-up resources elsewhere. Without fire, without cooking, human evolution would have faced a hard ceiling. The brain expansion that characterizes the transition from early hominids to anatomically modern humans, the dramatic increase in cranial capacity that occurred over the past 2 million years, was fueled almost literally, by the caloric surplus that cooking provided. Remove the cooking, and the evolutionary pressure driving brain expansion weakens substantially. The brain that emerged from that altered selective environment would be smaller, less metabolically demanding, less capable. The humans of the fire-free alternate world would not be modern humans. They would be something cognitively diminished. Not unintelligent by animal standards, but operating at a ceiling well below what our actual ancestors achieved. The thought experiment of ancient humans without fire immediately becomes a thought experiment about a different kind of being entirely, one whose cognitive range would make the civilization building, language developing, art creating feats of actual human prehistory largely inaccessible. The geography of human existence would be unrecognizable. Modern humans have colonized every continent except Antarctica, including environments that are biologically hostile to tropical primates by any objective measure. Siberia, Scandinavia, the high Arctic, Tierra del Fuego, the Tibetan Plateau, the Atacama Desert. These are environments where a naked, fireless primate would survive for hours to days, at best under adverse conditions. Fire made all of it possible, not just by providing warmth, but by enabling the cooking of foods available in those environments. The blubber-rich marine mammals of the Arctic, the root vegetables of the subarctic steppe, the difficult plant matter of cold climate ecosystems, in ways that made those foods nutritionally accessible to human metabolisms. Fire enabled the preservation of food through drying and smoking, extending the range of resources available across seasons. Fire enabled the processing of animal hides into clothing through smoking and drying, producing insulation that allowed human bodies to maintain core temperature in environments far outside the tropical comfort zone. Without fire, the human range contracts dramatically. Hominids without fire are hominids confined to the tropics and subtropics, the warm regions where ambient temperature and available raw food sources can support a large, metabolically demanding primate without external heat. Call it a band running roughly from the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, with limited extension into temperate zones during warm periods. This geographic confinement has cascading consequences. The colonization of Europe, of Northern Asia, of the Americas, which required crossing Beringia, a cold climate land bridge, and then dispersing through environments ranging from subarctic to temperate, all of this disappears from the timeline. Australia, reached by early humans crossing open water and then dispersing through varied climates, becomes far less accessible and perhaps inaccessible without the caloric and technological support of cooking. The human story, in the fire-free world, is a tropical story, a story of populations confined to the equatorial belt, competing with other large primates for the same resources, unable to exploit the vast temperate and cold regions that, in actual history, became some of the most densely populated and culturally productive parts of the world. The social dimension of fire removal is where things get philosophically interesting in ways that go beyond simple survival calculations. Fire did not just warm bodies and cook food. It restructured social time in a way that had enormous downstream consequences for human cognitive and cultural development. Specifically, fire extended the productive day. Before fire, hominid social activity was compressed into daylight hours. When the sun went down, the risks of moving around in darkness, from predators, from terrain hazards, from disorientation, made remaining stationary the only sensible option. Social interaction dropped off sharply at dusk. Information exchange, skill transmission, whatever forms of communication existed, all of this was constrained to the hours of adequate natural light. Firelight changed this completely. A fire at the center of a group gathering created a pool of social time that extended hours into the night, hours that had previously been lost to darkness and predator vigilance. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have documented a consistent pattern. Daytime conversation tends to be practical, focused on logistics, food acquisition, and immediate social coordination. Evening conversation around fire, fireside conversation, is dramatically more likely to involve storytelling, myth transmission, spiritual discussion, planning for hypothetical futures, and the kind of open-ended social bonding that builds the deep cultural cohesion of human groups. That fireside time is, many researchers argue, where a substantial portion of what makes human culture distinctively human was developed and transmitted. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The stories told around fires, the cosmologies, the moral frameworks, the histories, the explanations of the world were not entertainment. They were the operating system of the social group, transmitted nightly, updated across generations, encoding the accumulated wisdom and values of the community in a form that everyone could access and that bound the group together through shared narrative. Remove the fire, and that nightly social processing time vanishes. The cultural transmission that happened around fires does not simply migrate to a different setting, it disappears because no equivalent setting exists. The cognitive and social consequences of losing those evening hours of collective narrative building would, across thousands of generations, produce a cultural landscape dramatically impoverished compared to what actually developed. Predator pressure. This is a factor modern humans almost never think about because we have not lived under meaningful predator pressure for thousands of years. But for early hominids, predators were a constant, lethal, population-limiting reality. The predator assemblage of Pleistocene Africa included cave lions, leopards, hyenas, African wild dogs, and various other large carnivores that viewed hominids as prey, with exactly the same detachment they applied to any other available protein source. Hominid populations were limited not just by food availability, but by predation rates that pressed constantly on group sizes and ranging behaviors. Fire transformed this relationship. A fire at the center of a sleeping group is one of the most effective predator deterrents available to any animal. Large carnivores, with very few exceptions, avoid fire. The association between fire, heat, and danger is deep-seated enough that most predators will not approach a fire burning at night. A fireless hominid group sleeping on the ground is extremely vulnerable. A group sleeping around a fire is dramatically safer, to the point where the shift from tree sleeping to ground sleeping in human evolutionary history is thought by many researchers to correlate directly with the controlled use of fire. Ground sleeping, made possible by fire, had its own downstream consequences. Better quality sleep in more comfortable positions allows for more restorative rest cycles, which improves cognitive performance, immune function, and overall physical condition. The cognitive premium of consistently better sleep, compounding across thousands of generations, is not trivial. Without fire, hominids in the alternate timeline remain in trees at night, remain under severe predator pressure at ground level, remain constrained in their ranging behavior by the need to reach suitable sleeping trees before dark, and remain paying the cognitive and physical costs of the less restorative sleep that tree sleeping involves. The predator pressure alone would limit population sizes, limit ranging distances, and limit the kind of large, stable social groups that cultural complexity requires to develop and maintain. The technology cascade that never happens in the fire-free world is almost too extensive to enumerate, but attempting it reveals how central fire was to the entire material culture of human prehistory and history. Ceramics require fire. The ability to fire clay into durable, waterproof vessels for storage, cooking, and transport of liquids is one of the foundational technologies of settled human life. Without it, the storage of grain that agriculture requires, the carrying of water across distances, the preservation of food through fermentation in sealed containers, all of this becomes dramatically more difficult or impossible. Metalworking requires fire, bronze, iron, steel. The entire material progression of human technology from the Stone Age onward is a fire-dependent sequence. You cannot smelt copper without fire hot enough to melt rock. You cannot forge iron without sustained high-temperature heat. The tools, weapons, agricultural implements, and infrastructure components that define civilization from the Bronze Age onward require mastery of fire as a prerequisite so fundamental that the absence of fire doesn't just delay metallurgy, it removes it from the timeline entirely. The fired brick that built Mesopotamian cities, the charcoal that fired ancient Greek forges, the kiln-fired tile of Roman infrastructure, the glass blowing that produced everything from Roman luxury goods to medieval church windows to the laboratory equipment of the scientific revolution. The steam engine, that most fire-dependent of devices, that drove the Industrial Revolution. All of it, the entire technological sequence that produced the modern world, has fire as its non-negotiable prerequisite. The fire-free alternate world does not simply have a delayed version of human civilization. It has a categorically different technological ceiling, one that tops out somewhere in the late Stone Age and stays there. No ceramics, no metals, no glass, no steam power, no industrial revolution, no modern world. The technological history of humanity without fire is a story that never gets past its opening chapters. Consider what fire meant for medicine because this dimension receives almost no attention and deserves it. Heat sterilization, the application of fire or boiling water to kill pathogens on wounds, tools, and surfaces, is one of the oldest and most effective medical interventions available to pre-modern societies. The boiling of water to remove biological contamination was practiced in ancient cultures across the world and saved incalculable numbers of lives from waterborne disease. The cauterization of wounds with hot metal or coals to prevent infection and control bleeding was a surgical technique used from ancient Egypt through the medieval period. The preparation of medicinal plant compounds frequently requires heat, teas, decoctions, and extracts that concentrate active compounds from plants in ways that raw consumption cannot achieve. Many of the pharmacological properties of plant medicines are only accessible after heat processing. The warming of patients with fever-induced delirium or hypothermia, fire as a direct medical tool, saved lives in ways that had measurable impact on population survival rates. Without fire, human populations in the alternate timeline face higher rates of waterborne disease from contaminated water sources, higher rates of wound infection without cauterization or heat sterilization, reduced access to medicinal plant compounds, and no protection against hypothermia in cold environments. Mortality rates rise. Life expectancies fall. Population growth is slower, more constrained, more vulnerable to environmental disruptions. The demographic consequence of higher mortality across every life stage compounds over thousands of generations into populations that are smaller, less dense, and less capable of developing the social complexity that large, stable populations support. The spiritual and psychological dimension of fire deserves honest examination because it speaks to something deep in the human relationship with this technology. Every major religious and spiritual tradition on Earth has fire at its center in some form. The eternal flame, the sacred hearth, the burning bush, the Olympic torch, the Zoroastrian fire temple, where sacred flames have been maintained continuously for over 1,000 years. The Hindu yajna, the sacred fire ritual, the candles of every religious tradition that uses them, the lantern festivals of East Asian cultures, the bonfire traditions of European folk religion. This is not coincidence. Fire was not a metaphor that human cultures chose for spiritual significance. It was the literal center of human social and physical life for hundreds of thousands of years before any of these specific traditions formalized around it. The spiritual significance of fire reflects the depth of the practical and psychological centrality of fire in human experience. The fire, as warmth, as safety, as the boundary between human social space and the dark outside, as the technology that made the night habitable and the world navigable. A humanity without fire would not simply lack these traditions. It would lack the cognitive and social development that these traditions represent. The religious and philosophical systems that humans developed are themselves products of the cognitive expansion that fire-enabled nutrition and the social processing time of firelit evenings made possible. Remove fire from the foundation, and the entire superstructure of human spiritual and intellectual culture has nothing to grow on. Now step back and look at the complete picture of what the fire-free world actually contains. It contains hominids, intelligent by animal standards, probably more so than any other animal alive, because the raw cognitive architecture is there, but cognitively capped well below the level of anatomically modern humans, because the nutritional investment in expanded brain tissue that cooking enabled never fully materialized. These hominids are confined to the tropics and subtropics. They live in groups limited in size by predator pressure and resource availability. They sleep in trees or in defensible positions with constant predator vigilance. Their technology is stone tools, Oldowan or Acheulean levels, the earliest and most rudimentary forms of lithic technology, because the more sophisticated technologies that came later in actual history were fire-assisted in various ways. They have culture, rudimentary, orally transmitted within narrow community boundaries, without the fireside evening hours that in actual history allowed cultural content to accumulate and transmit with such richness. They have language in some form, communication sophisticated enough for social coordination, but without the depth and abstraction that actual human language achieved, because that linguistic depth was built on cognitive architecture that the nutritional ceiling of a fireless diet never fully enabled. They have no agriculture. Agriculture requires the ability to settle in one place for extended periods, which requires the ability to store food, which requires containers, which in durable form requires ceramics, which requires fire. The seasonal nomadism of the fireless hominid never resolves into the settled permanence that agricultural revolution requires. They have no civilization, no cities, no writing, no mathematics beyond the most elementary counting, no formal legal systems, no organized religion in the architectural and institutional sense, no recorded history, no science, no technology beyond what can be achieved with stone, bone, wood, and sinew. Materials that are extraordinarily versatile, but that reach a ceiling well below what fire-assisted materials can achieve. They persist. They are successful, in the biological sense, surviving, reproducing, adapting to local conditions across the equatorial belt. But they are not progressing in the directional sense that actual human history progressed. They are not accumulating knowledge and technology across generations in ways that compound into civilization. They are animals, remarkable, intelligent, socially complex animals, but animals in the sense of being participants in the ecosystem rather than transformers of it. Here is the piece that ties everything together, and that gives the thought experiment its most unsettling edge. We did not discover fire. We did not invent it. We encountered it, and then we were changed by it so completely that the beings who emerged from that encounter were categorically different from the beings who walked into it. The lightning strike that started the fire that first curious hominid approached, that event, or the accumulated series of such events across hundreds of thousands of years of opportunistic exploitation before controlled fire-making was mastered, is not a chapter in human history. It is the precondition for everything that followed. It is the threshold before which the story is about something else entirely. The question of what ancient humans would have been without fire is, in the deepest sense, the question of whether we would exist at all in any meaningful sense. Not physically. The hominid lineage might well have persisted. But the cognitive, cultural, technological, social entity that we call humanity, the thing that makes cave paintings and languages and cities and philosophies and music and scientific theories, that entity is, to an extraordinary degree, a product of fire. We are, quite literally, made of what we cooked. Our brains are the size they are because our ancestors could extract more calories from their food than their competitors. Our social complexity is what it is because our ancestors had warm, safe, predator-free evenings to spend talking to each other. Our technology is what it is because our ancestors learned to shape the world with heat. Our range is what it is because our ancestors could survive in environments that would have killed their predecessors. Every human achievement, every artwork, every scientific discovery, every philosophical insight, Every building, every machine, every word of every language ever written has fire somewhere near its root. Not as a metaphor, as a material precondition. The ancient hominid in the tree, watching the burning acacia across 300 meters of dark savanna, made a decision, or had a response, or followed an impulse that changed the trajectory of life on this planet more profoundly than almost any other single development in the 4 billion year history of complex life on Earth. They came down from the tree. They approached the fire. They stayed near its warmth through the night, and they were different in the morning than they had been the evening before. And here we are. Everything we are, everything we've built, everything we've thought and created and argued about and celebrated and mourned, all of it exists on the other side of that single, unremarkable, world-changing moment. A very good reason, if you needed one, to find fire a little more astonishing than you probably did this morning.